To assemble the clutch, start with the centre piece. The spring goes on there. It's got one small tag on it that drops into that little notch in the centre piece, just like that. Take your cheap crimp lug pliers, hold that in gently, rotate that clockwise to pull the spring into line. And here is the outer part. Slide that over the spring. There we have it. Here's our clutch assembled. Moves smoother in one direction than the other, and that's the correct direction, so you can't go wrong. Right, bit of synthetic grease through the centre. Drop that into the top of the camera. That should engage with the slots in the top of the spool, just like that. The bush. The top guide bush for our film advance. I'm going to squeeze some glue into there. Some grease rather. Just like that. Same principle as packing wheel bearings. Hydraulic pressure. That bush goes on there, plain side up, countersunk side down. That little ratchet pawl goes on there. Let's put a touch of grease on that screw. Run that lightly down. Make sure that the pawl is free to move. That looks good. The guide post, the screw with the shoulder on it, goes over here. And that shoulder supports the shutter cocking rack. Right, that looks like good enough. I'll do those two screws up tight. And I'll put the spring, return spring, on that pawl. It's not wanting to go into place. That screwdriver is magnetised. That's not helping me. Try something else. Oh, it doesn't want to go around that screw head. Must be too close to the wall. It's just slacking it off. That's better. Not enough clearance between the screw head and the wall of that little recess. You can get the leg of that spring around the right side. That's better. It's where it should be. Good. Now that's surround for the back catch release lever. I'll just put that underneath the film advance here to support it while I'm assembling the rest of the mechanism. Otherwise it can get very frustrating. Alright, little touch of grease under there and round the centre. Roll that in anti-clockwise. It should push the pawl out of the way. There we go. I just usually point that to the front. The leaf spring goes in. I normally give that a little wipe with a bit of grease just to make sure, just to protect it from corrosion really. No other special reason. That goes on. That drive dog goes on. That washer goes on. That gear goes on. And this screw goes on the top without disturbing the little pinion gear which is seated over the squared off top of the shaft. Alright, just tighten that down, that should be good. On the underside, want to get the lever in for the rewind button catch. So I'll put a bit of molybdenum paste on the end of that and wipe around the centre at the pivot just for good measure. Its return spring, it's looking a bit anemic, let's just bend that out a bit. And there's a shoulder screw that goes through there. The spring revolves around one shoulder and the lever revolves around another. So you make sure you don't get either the spring or the lever trapped under the screw so that it won't move. That looks good. I've got to hook that spring over. So that the lever will be sprung loaded. Lift that end of the spring over like that, so that lever's sprung loaded now. So the sprocket shaft and the sprocket can go in there. Sprocket goes in with the slot upwards. The sprocket shaft usually takes some synthetic grease, some towards the bottom, some towards the top. A little bit on the gear on the top doesn't hurt. It slots in down there, through the sprocket, at the bottom. Got my finger supporting that shaft from the top, at the bottom. Pull that lever across, that allows that shaft to drop right through. And moving the sprocket, the take-up spool here engaged the gear and allowed that to fully engage. So that's sitting in position. I'll close the front of the camera. There's a screw that goes in here that drives that. The same as the screws that form the pins, hinge pins for the front door. See if I can get that screw to start. No, it's not starting today. Let's try the other side. Sometimes they're easier to start on one side of that hole than the other. They should be threaded all the way through, but one side might have more of a lead. It doesn't want to start. Right, what's going on here? It's going in. That was very reluctant to start. Must have been a particularly neat fit. Right, the rewind button next, and its spring, and the washer that forms part of that mechanism here. So usually I just apply some grease to the spring, put it on the button, pass that through the washer, and that should screw into the end of the sprocket shaft. I'm just rolling that sprocket shaft back with my fingers. Make sure that the button will depress and it's not caught. That looks good. And I'll tighten that up with my special pliers. That all looks good. This film advance, let's get this closed up at the base. Okay, so whereabouts are we with this? Where's our start position? Our start position, that's where we want to start with our advance lever. That's one turn of advance on the return spring. The 3 screws hold this cover on the base. Now we're going to be careful doing this that I don't press the film release button on the top of the film release shaft on the top of the camera, otherwise the film advance will wind backwards and release all the tension I've just carefully put in it, and I'll have to start again. Generally that means removing this cover so that you've got access to everything. Here's the third of the nickel screws. Now I could go mad and put the leatherette back on the base at this stage, but that would be a very foolhardy thing to do because probably we'll end up having to undo something. So we'll just put the film advance lever on the base. Two of the 3 screws will do for our purposes. Now, press down the release button, hold down the lock lever, film advance lever swings smoothly. That feels very good. Okay, that feels like it's got good tension to return it to the rest position. And at this stage, I think the shutter cocking rack could go into the camera. Oh, you missed a bit of that. The video camera hadn't started. I've just put the strap lug on, and I've just put this strap on, and I haven't put this shim washer underneath it yet because I don't know whether it needs it. So I'm just checking the action. It doesn't want to return to the rest position. If we slacken these screws up just slightly, let's see how it behaves. Fine. So the shim washer certainly needs to be under there, where the screw is. So we'll lift the screw out, find our shim washer, which is actually quite a generous one. Slide that under there. Put the screw back in place, tighten it down and see what we get. Well, that action's good, it's nice and smooth. How much movement have we got on that? Probably too much. I think that shim washer could be replaced with a thinner one. So I'm going to take that out and try a thinner shim washer under there. We don't want it any looser than it needs to be because that would give us too much backlash on the gears on that shaft running through, and that may encourage premature failure. So I'll try a thinner washer than that one. Come on, video camera, keep up. That's a bit better. That's the one I want to try. Let's see if that'll do the job. The shim washers are not always used in a position like this. They're used when they're necessary to give adequate clearance. That one works fine. That's nice and smooth. So we don't need that thicker washer, so I will put that one aside. We're using the thinner washer. I'll check that I've got everything tightened down there. Check the action again. That's good. That's exactly as it should be. Right, what's next? Well, on the camera body, really, I think the rangefinder's next. So I better sort that out. Let's get this shutter releases. Shaft is not seated correctly. Why not? That's better. It had just popped up. That's better. Okay, so I better see about the rangefinder. Or better still, why not put the shutter in place since we've got a complete and finished shutter. It sounded promising. Right, I think we'll call that correctly positioned, and I'll put its retaining ring in place. There's potential to over tension the shutter by a good tooth on that rack, and that doesn't do you any good. Basically you end up over tensioning your main drive spring each time. Of course it releases back to the preset place as soon as the wind stroke finishes. Checking the action of this. That's good. It's moving nice and smoothly. Undo some of that tension on that spring. I just want enough there to stop that shaft falling out and causing me grief. Not stopping it from lifting by itself. Right, but it's releasing the shutter before it releases the film advance, so I need to back that up a bit. That feels very good. Now we're ready for the rangefinder. I better see about this. Now this rangefinder, it's very dirty. It's no fun to see through. I'm looking pretty much straight into the sun here, but you cannot see through that rangefinder. It's just filthy. So to dismantle it, well, the first thing to do is to take the arm off. So I'll stretch that out, spring out, remove that pin. I'm running out of parts to put on the camera now, so I can move to a smaller container for those, I think. Now, I'm going to mark this so that I get this arm back in the same place, because you can adjust the position of the arm backwards or forwards in the rangefinder. And if it's in the wrong position, you end up in trouble. And it's awkward to get it back in the right position. So it's best if you make a point of putting it back where it came from. So that's what I'll do. I've got a tool here to undo that pinhead screw. Got our screw, the washer, and there's a lot of filth under here. You can probably see that that's grit or something, that's sand or something messy. It's quite marked under here. That's the bush that the screw runs into, and the bush slides in a slot from inside here. That casting is quite porous. It must have been fairly early in the manufacture and they were having trouble making things, or their quality control wasn't as good as it became later. So I'll undo those two screws. They hold the prism in the end here, and they also serve to adjust the vertical alignment. Have that prism out. At the back, single screw here, that looks very chewed up. There's a bit of corrosion here, suggesting that this rangefinder has been wet at some stage. Now that rear lens is the right way round. I thought it was the wrong way at first, but no, it is the right way. Remove that screw. I normally work from the outside here. Take that off. Now we get into the tricky dismantling. That spring clip that holds the mirror in place, and that mask, they don't want to move. That mask has got corrosion on it. This is an early camera. You can see that that's a full rectangle. Later cameras, that was a broken rectangle. It only showed you the corners. The front one's probably the same. Remove its retaining spring. Now this is locked in place with a touch of lacquer, top and bottom. Now I need to use some acetone to break that lacquer so that I can get this unit out, because here we have a plastic mask on the front, then we have a glass lens, then we have a metal mask, then we have a thin piece of glass with a silvered rectangle on it. So If I just press on that, I'll break something, so I need acetone. Let's have a little bit of contrast reduction so people can see what's happening here. Right, so I pick up a drop of acetone, lay it on that patch of lacquer on the top, do the same at the bottom, repeat, hopefully that acetone will soften that lacquer. Now normally what I do is there's two little metal tab each end of that metal mask. Normally I just flick that with my fingernail, lightly. And if the acetone's done its job, that'll separate the components. And if the acetone hasn't done its job, it won't. You don't want to force it. Those piece of glass with the silvered lines on it is very thin and fragile. And if you force it, when it's all glued together with lacquer, you're going to break it. Which means then you've got to find a parts camera to provide a replacement. That lacquer is not softening up particularly well. Well, they've been particularly generous with it. I'll try running some down the casting here. I think they've been extra generous with it. Let's run a bit of acetone down the end here. Ooh. Oh, something gave. Right, I can see there now that the thin glass is pushed away, so that's no longer held firmly. Well, that's the most fragile component, so we have that out. The metal mask will probably come out, it does. I'm left with the main glass lens and that plastic component glued in there still. Let's try a bit more. I don't know what that plastic mask's made out of, but it's not susceptible to acetone, which is very, very fortunate, of course, because otherwise this task would be somewhat difficult. Yeah, it's come loose. Push that out the end. Okay. So this lot was all glued together with that lacquer. I've got to clean all these components carefully with acetone before I do anything else. These glass components here, I mean, not the body of this. I'd only end up taking paint off it if I went mad on that. So let me start here. You can see that smear on the edge, that's where this was stuck down with the lacquer. That's a good start. Put that to one side. Start on this. Now, I'm going to be reasonably cautious cleaning these pieces of glass with the silvered lines on them, because the silvered lines might clean right off. Generally they don't, but they will disappear. They disappear over time just from atmospheric contaminants, as far as I can tell. There's a spot of lacquer on here, I can see it. Yeah, I've just shifted that. And holding this up to the light, I can judge by reflections how clean I've got that surface. I want it very clean. I'm going to clean it in the ultrasonic cleaner as well. But I want anything that I can see on there I want off now. Obviously the silvered lines are only on one surface of this glass, it's not duplicated on both surfaces. This little front window, the silvered lines face inwards. If you shift the thing around in your fingers, you can judge which side of the glass the silvered lines are on. I'll put that in there back in its spot at the front. And the other piece of glass was this one. Well, this one didn't have any lacquer on it, of course. But often it's quite dirty. The silvered lines on this one point towards the front of the camera. They face the other silvered lines. So I'm going to make sure I got this round the right way. That's good. I'll slide that into its little groove. And put that retainer back in place. There's one other mirror in here. That's the semi-silvered mirror here. Now that surface of that's quite delicate, and if you poke at it or something to clean it, you'll end up taking the silver off it. So I always clean this in the ultrasonic cleaner. I do not attempt to clean that semi-silvered mirror manually. I'm just going to clean any grease off here with a touch of naphtha just to get it off that surface. Right, that's ready to go in the ultrasonic cleaner, and basically I put that in a small glass with a few drops of dishwashing liquid in hot water, put it in the ultrasonic, put that in the ultrasonic cleaner tank so it's surrounded by water, and usually 3 minutes is long enough with my ultrasonic cleaner, and that will clean all that. As soon as it's finished its 3 minutes, I run it under the hot tap and then blow any droplets away with a blower while I'm drying it with a hairdryer. If you leave any droplets of moisture on there and let them dry on the glass, it'll just leave coffee rings. It'll always be obvious. So you've got to blow away any droplets as they form. Right, well that's all I need to do. I'll go away and do that and come back when it's all clean.